Aha! Mackenzie. You should have told me you were in the cookhouse this morning. You were absent on parade.
I wasn't in the cookhouse this morning, Sergeant.
What do you mean you weren't in the cookhouse?
What makes you think that?
Well, why else would you be wearing a potato sack?
I can explain.
Look at you.
There was another letter, Sergeant. Apparently it was from that Rob fellow, and he said, well, he took pity on me for last time because I was wearing an old uniform, and so he left this off, and he said, it says right, apparently this is the way of the future.
Way of the future, eh? Let me tell you about the way of your future. Cookhouse. Potatoes. Double away.
In parts 1 and 2, we outlined articles of clothing used on the channel. In part 3, we'll cover items of personal kit. Some mention of the discipline of historical shooting is particularly appropriate here. Three things combine to form this most interesting field of study. First and foremost are the firearms, good quality originals or reproductions being most desirable. Historical, personal kit, and clothing is the second, with the clothing aspect forming a very minor part. And the third is period documentation, history, and anecdotal evidence to place the use of the firearms and kit in the proper context. In the case of historical shooting in a military context, period manuals and treatises form the most important source of information. Second to these are some very well written books, two examples of which are DeWitt Bailey's British Military Flintlock Rifles and Chris Rhodes' The British Soldier's Firearm. On the Martini front, a good reference is the Martini Henry Notebook by Malcolm Cobb. And a longtime member of the Die Hard Company, as well as the founder of the Martini Henry Society, Neil Aspenshaw, has a book coming out in the very near future which should prove to be one of the defining tomes on the subject. I couldn't possibly go any further without mention of a very important reference. Without it, there would be no hope of reproducing items to any degree of accuracy. This is, of course, Soldiers' Accoutrements of the British Army by P.R. Turner. A longtime illustrator of various Osprey titles, he put his pen to creating the finest book of its type. The illustrations therein are to scale, and are done with a mind to reproducing these items. Truly one of the community's best additions. Historical shooting exists on a scale between the activities of target or recreational shooting on one end, and reenactment or living history on the other. What sets it apart from the former is context. In the case of this channel, a predominantly Victorian military one. And from reenactment, why of course, the use of live ammunition, which brings a completely different level to the historical experience. Historical shooting is not just shooting historical firearms, but rather shooting them in a certain context. Whereas reenactment or living history might focus on some of the minutiae of kit and equipment, historical shooting does lend itself to a certain degree of flexibility in regards to the items used. In this video, we'll outline some of the items of personal equipment used on the channel. As you will see, there are some historical inaccuracies, but this is mitigated by the fact that it's not so much the look or the historical authenticity as much as it is the function of the individual item. There were three general designs of water bottle or canteen in the Victorian era. I have managed to acquire examples of all three. The blue, wooden variety, constructed like a small keg, was used from the late 1700s and served with minor changes until the 1870s. Holding 3 pints, stopped with a simple wooden plug, it was large and encumbering. Mine is from Jim Keller Reproductions in Ontario. Initially, I was dead set on making my own, but Jim's example is of such good quality at such a reasonable price that I decided to go that route. It is of the pre-1860 style, with the exposed chimes on the outside edge. I do have plans to convert one face to the 1860s pattern with the hidden chimes. I've waterproofed it internally with an ample application of beeswax. Replacing the blue wooden variety from the early 1870s, the Italian pattern water bottle had been adopted from that of, go figure, the Italian army. Also made of wood, it was of smaller proportions and had a unique stopper arrangement allowing for filling and drinking. Its adoption coincided with the issue of the P-71 valise equipment and served until the mid-1890s, spanning the use of no less than 3 sets of equipment. It went through 2 general patterns, one supported on a sling with a carriage, the other used for a very limited time with the pattern 1882 valise equipment that used a large spring clip attached to the rim to clip over the waist belt. This pattern was replaced by the readoption of the older slung version in the early 1880s. My Italian pattern water bottle was a gift from a friend of the channel, Grant. Surely one of the channel's greatest benefactors to date, he took pity on me and my use of my round metal version for videos covering the 1870s and 80s, and sent it along surplus to his needs. It was originally from IMA and came with a very cheap riveted carriage. This I replaced with one I made from a pattern in Pierre Turner's book. It does have a reasonable facsimile of the stopper with its filling and drinking options. From the late 1880s and the mid-1890s, a new enameled metal water bottle entered service. Not appearing in any quantity till the mid-1890s, there were a couple of patterns. Covered in drab felt, initial patterns maintained the filling and drinking stopper, as used with the Italian pattern. Generally flat and round, their shape changed slightly with different patterns. This would be the water bottle used predominantly during the Boer War. The water bottle I used to replicate this pattern is actually a reproduction of a version used during the American Civil War. Widely available through numerous dealers, it was purchased with a blue felt cover. I changed the strap that it came with, made of fabric, for a leather one that I made. This was the first water bottle purchased for use on the channel, and I decided on this example as I thought it would generally cover the Victorian era. It was blue, matching the color of the early wooden variety, and therefore somewhat suited to the 1850s and 60s. But it was also of the same general shape as the metal pattern examples from the 1890s. Such is historical shooting. As already mentioned, the other, more historical water bottles have slowly come into the fold, and once that occurred, I decided to modify the metal one slightly. Impressed by Grant's own modification of a similar bottle, I inquired, and he sent along the remnants of the material he used in covering his. This khaki wool was much better suited to replicate an example from the 1890s than perhaps the blue was. The metalwork received a light coat of blue spray paint to mimic the blue enamel color that the originals had. Haversacks were a ubiquitous feature of military accoutrements, although they were only issued for campaign purposes up until 1857, after which they became general issue for all soldiers. Primarily intended to carry the ration, up to 3 days at a time, they were, in Napoleonic times, quite large. Of course, they were undoubtedly used to carry all kinds of things, as a utility-type pouch might be used for utensils, personal items, and extra ammunition. As the Victorian era advanced, the haversack patterns evolved, generally getting smaller towards the end of the 19th century. They were made of unbleached linen or cotton, although photographic evidence would seem to indicate that they became whiter as the era progressed, notwithstanding black versions used by members of rifle regiments. When empty, they were folded up and buttoned out of the way. Mine is based on a pattern from the 1880s and is of moderate proportions. I made it from a light canvas, and it is very durable. As viewers of the channel may be aware, I use it to carry the most used shooting accessories, including cleaning supplies, binoculars, tools, and a very Victorian laser rangefinder. The style of equipment in use from the 1700s through the 1870s, and indeed in other parts of the empire beyond, could collectively be known as knapsack equipment. The knapsack evolved from a simple bag slung over the shoulder, used from the early 1700s or late 1600s. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, it was still rudimentary in design, but it evolved rapidly, taking on familiar features. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it was made of black oilskin for weatherproofing, and was generally of a folded pattern, much like a complicated envelope. Secured with straps, it was intended to carry extra clothing, blankets, and other sundries. By the Victorian era, this evolved into a more formal version known as a box knapsack, with its sides stiffened by boards to maintain its shape even when empty. Evolving through a number of different patterns, the final pattern, issued from the late 1850s, was used through the 1860s into the 1870s. In Canada, this particular type of knapsack was used until the 1890s. I made mine from a pattern in, you guessed it, P.R. Turner, that dates from the mid-1850s. It's made of black oilskin with leather reinforcing and straps. It measures 17 inches across, 12 inches high, and 4 inches deep, and I used 3/8 plywood to stiffen it. Much like the haversack, I've adopted the knapsack not to carry historical items, but rather shooting supplies and equipment, including targetry, a spotting scope, my aiming rest, and a chronograph. Further information about the haversack and knapsack contents can be found in the video on the subject. Although the Brown Bess has not yet taken its place in the catalogue of videos, save for one small bit, nevertheless I've had an associated ammunition pouch for it for quite some time. Brown Bess accoutrements went through many changes and were not what one might call standard until well into the 1800s. Generally, they consisted of a black leather pouch with a block of wood drilled to accept cartridges mounted in the top half, with storage space for more ammunition and various other and sundry items below. Mine is a pattern from the very late 1700s and would have been used in the early Napoleonic Wars. It holds 29 rounds in the block with space for another 20 below. There is an opening in the front of the pouch for access to the space below the block. I have a tin there now, but patterns such as this often had a simple open space created by fastening the block of wood high in the pouch with screws. Historically, its ammunition capacity was augmented by the carriage of a smaller tin pouch covered in leather known as a magazine, carried on the bayonet belt. It came from a company in the UK that is sadly no longer trading, but examples such as this and others can be had online from numerous dealers. In use with the Brown Bess and later weapons well into the 1850s was the bayonet belt. In the 1700s, the bayonet was carried on a waist belt. Later in the century, it became common that the waist belt was carried over the shoulder, as it was more comfortable scrambling through bush or on the march. The practice became so commonplace that a dedicated pattern was approved in 1784. The dimensions changed over time, but it was generally worn over the right shoulder, with the two ends held together and adjusted by means of a crossbelt plate in the center of the chest, which had a series of studs and hooks. This arrangement was last used during the Crimean War. My bayonet belt was made from a pattern in P.R. Turner and dates from the early 1800s. I chose a version with a simple frog that would hold either the Brown Bess or the Enfield bayonet. In preparation for an upcoming project, I decided to make a representation of the Grenadier Guards crossbelt plate. The pattern of plate is not truly historical, but uses a similar method of attachment and belt adjustment, with the excess being kept under control by a small leather loop on the back. In its twilight, the bayonet belt carried this way was strapped to the ammunition pouch, keeping both near the center of the back. The equipment used by riflemen of the Napoleonic era was different in many respects to that worn by the line infantry. First and foremost, it was black. This set of equipment has become somewhat iconic and was made up of a waist belt to carry a ball bag and the sword, and an ammo pouch with crossbelt, which featured leather tubes to contain the cord that held the powder horn. As explored in the Baker Rifle series of videos, the horn, and indeed seemingly all loose ammunition components, were made redundant by the late Napoleonic era, being supplanted by the exclusive use of cartridges. I have chosen to keep the horn and its associated flask as it is with loose patched ball that I typically shoot the Baker with. The pouch is a fairly standard affair that came out of the UK, but was a hand-me-down. I use it to hold extra balls, flints, and some other incidental items, as well as the flask when not in use. The horn was purchased through Track of the Wolf. With its modern fittings, it doesn't quite have the period look, but functions as a powder horn should, as a magazine to replenish the powder used from the flask. I made the crossbelt as well as the waist belt. My waist belt holds two pouches that are quite ahistorical. One, on the left front, holds lubricated patches, while the other, at the right front, carries bullets, a short starter, and a priming flask, holding 4F powder for the priming of the Baker. The pricker and brush are from Track of the Wolf, as well as the priming and shooting flasks. Track of the Wolf is a great place for muzzle loading or black powder cartridge shooting supplies. For further information, might I suggest visiting the forum run by the 2nd Battalion 95th Rifles, a living history group from the UK. They take their research very seriously, and it is there for viewing on their website. In use in British service from the 1850s to the 1880s, and in Canada until finally replaced in the late 1890s by the Oliver equipment, Enfield and Snider versions of the standard components of pouch, belt, and waist belt enjoyed a particularly long service life. As you might understand, covering such a large time frame, there are numerous combinations of different belts, pouches, and frogs used on the channel. The transition back to the waist belt began in 1850, but had not been completed by the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1854. Indeed, many battalions, including 3 of the Guards, still wore the old crossbelt arrangement. The first pattern waist belt had a fixed, sewn-on frog for the bayonet, but this was replaced shortly after by a plain belt and conventional frog. For use on the channel, I have the ability to call on a number of different combinations of kit, depending on what I'm shooting. The belts most often used are a couple of Edwardian general service belts, issued in the early 20th century as a ceremonial item. The belts from the personal equipment of the era were either brown or made of webbing. They nevertheless look the part, if one can overlook the wrong pattern of buckle. For use with the short rifle in the guise of a rifleman, I have a similar version that I made in black leather. I recently took the donation for the channel of an original pattern rifle's buckle that I've used to replace the reproduction previously worn. Thanks very much to Morris from New Zealand, whose acquaintance I met through the British Military Forum. The frogs used in the mid-Victorian era were of a couple of patterns. For the socket bayonet of both the Enfield and Snider, a pattern from 1854 is used. For the sword of the short rifles, both Enfield and Snider, a black frog with securing buckle and strap was used. I made my 54 pattern frog from Pierre Turner, and the black one came with the reproduction scabbard that I ordered for the P60 sword. The latter is not completely correct, but close enough for my purposes. Used from the late 1850s in conjunction with the waist belt was a relatively new concept, the expense pouch, taking the idea, perhaps from the Rifle Corps who had used such a piece of kit since Napoleonic times. The first pattern of 1855 was issued in the waning stages of the Crimean War. The intent of this extra pouch was to make ammunition more readily available. Packets were to be carried in the main pouch, while loose rounds, taken from their wrappers, were put in the pouch for immediate use. This made loading more efficient, a key factor in the days of the muzzleloader. This pattern pouch held up to 20 rounds in a small tin. My 1855 pattern pouch is from Heritage Leathers from the United States. Not to be confused with a company that is currently trading. They went out of business some time ago, but were at the time the only company making British kit. Nowadays there are a number of companies making this particular piece. VMA Leathers in New Zealand and Lapierre from the United States, to name 2. Introduced by circular memorandum in 1859 and ratified in the list of changes in 1861, a second pattern ball bag was introduced. This semicircular version carried fewer rounds, 10, a rag, and a small sleeve inside for an oil bottle, whereas the 1855 pattern was gradually replaced from the early 1860s. The 61 or 59 pattern made the transition to the Snider. This pattern, and the lack of cap pouch on the chest, being the hallmarks of Snider-equipped infantry. I have 2 59 or 61 pattern expense pouches, one white and one black. The white one is from VMA Leathers in New Zealand, perhaps the vendor with the widest selection of mid-Victorian kit at the time of this video. Their products are quite good, with good materials and correct measurements. My black one was from the aforementioned Heritage Leathers, sadly no longer trading. Stoutly constructed, as mentioned, I use it for mostly Snider shooting. In service with the Enfield, the pouch featured an internal compartment for 50 rounds in packets, an external pouch for extra percussion caps, and a small compartment to hold the nipple wrench. It was not intended for immediate access, the ball bag providing that capability, and was typically worn pushed well back on the rear of the hip. This pouch was eventually adapted for use with the Snider by removal of the external cap pouch and modification of the tin to take the differently shaped packets of Snider ammunition. This style of pouch was generally replaced in the 1870s with the issue of the 1871 valise equipment. But it was still in service, along with the last pattern expense pouch, with the York and Lancaster Regiment during their service in the Sudan in 1884, who, having been deployed there from Aden and initially India, had suffered from a somewhat high degree of lack of resupply. In that case, it carried ammunition for their martinis. In Canadian service, its use extended into the late 1890s, as indeed did its corresponding items in the expense pouch and knapsack. My pouch I used with the Enfields was from Heritage Leathers, and conforms generally to the 59 pattern, with its 50-round tin, external percussion cap pouch, and internal pouch for their nipple wrench in the flap. I have another for use with their short rifles with their black belts. It too was from Heritage Leathers, although the flap is made with the flesh side out. As I predominantly shoot the short Snider with this pouch, I have removed the tin to accommodate the differently shaped Snider packets. Again, VMA Leathers in New Zealand stocks a similar pattern. I have one other pouch that I typically use with my long Snider. It's a cheaper variety, commonly found, stocked by American Civil War vendors. So, all totaled, any of 4 rifles can be accompanied by a relatively accurate corresponding set of equipment. The 1855 pouch for the Enfield, the 1861 for the long Snider, and the black 61 for either the short Enfield or the short Snider. When the Army made the switch to percussion arms in the early 1840s, a new piece of kit entered service, the cap pouch. Initially, either a small pouch on the belt or an even smaller one built into the coatee just above the waist were the methods used to carry the caps. There were other variations of early cap pouches, particularly in the Guards, with the Grenadiers using a buff example on the waist belt, the Coldstream one sewn low on the pouch belt, and the Scots Guards, at the time the Scotch Fusilier Guards, seem to have used the version set into the coatee or later the tunic. Once the concept of the expense pouch or ball bag was introduced, this space became very crowded, and from 1857 the cap pouch began to be moved to the pouch belt. Carried high in the center of the chest, its location made for efficient use, being well out of the way of the rifle held at the waist for the capping evolution. It was a simple affair, sometimes lined with wool to make the drawing of caps easier. It was held to the belt by the friction fit of a loop of leather, angled so it would reside on the chest on the level. Mine are from the old Heritage Leathers, and are in both white and black. VMA in New Zealand carries both patterns, as does Lapierre. So this brings us to the end of part 3. Hopefully it's given you a good overview of kit used on the channel for representations up to 1870. It was this style of equipment that was worn during the first half of the Victorian era, the Crimea, the Indian Mutiny, and on into the 1860s. Next in the series, we'll cover the 3 patterns of valise equipment, namely the P71, 82, and 88 or Slade Wallace. In addition, we'll also cover the 1908 pattern webbing. As in previous videos, links to the suppliers and vendors are included in the description below. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.